I was a young assistant professor of history at the University of Tulsa when I read my first book by Howard Zinn in 1967. It was Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal. It was not his first book. He had already written a study of Fiorello LaGuardia's congressional career, 2 books growing out of his involvement in the early civil rights movement while teaching at Spelman College in Atlanta, SNCC, The New Abolitionists, and The Southern Mystique, and had edited a collection of New Deal thought. But the Vietnam book was my introduction to Howard Zinn, and it was a powerful, even life-changing experience for me. To help you understand why, I need to say just a few words about myself. I was born in 1940, so some of my earliest memories are of World War II. I think I remember the death of FDR, and I'm even more confident that I remember the end of the war and personalizing it to my uncles D.W. and Harvey coming back home. Parenthetically, my life was deeply affected by World War II far too early for me to remember it. Just a few months after I was born in western Arkansas, the government came in and bought out all the families in the area to turn it into Fort Chaffee. Wars do that kind of thing to people's lives, don't they? I did not know, as I grew up, that there was anything to do with wars your country got involved in other than support them. It was not until I became a serious student of history that I learned there had been opposition to all of our wars. And it was not until Vietnam that I began to develop first questions about and then opposition to a war myself. Howard's 1967 book helped me reach that position, as it did for so many others. I remember before reading it feeling uncomfortable, maybe sort of guilty even, for having doubts about what we were doing in Vietnam. That book was revelatory for me, and within months I was speaking out against the war myself. To do so was unpopular in Tulsa, Oklahoma at that time. The University of Tulsa has a Presbyterian background and is deeply connected to and supported by oil wealth. Tulsa itself has sometimes been called the buckle of the Bible Belt, think Oral Roberts, among others. And Oklahoma has not even voted Democratic in a presidential election since 1964 and is one of the reddest of the red states in today's terminology, though the state does have significant progressive radical elements in its past, and I'm on a mission to resurrect that tradition. But since that 1967 turning point, I have come to believe deeply that we live in a world in which war is never the best solution to a problem, and that to say that in general, and now about what we are doing in Iraq in particular, is deeply moral, even patriotic. I thank Howard Zinn, in part, for helping me advance to that position. His 1970 book, The Politics of History, was revelatory for me in a broader way. History is political? And of course, his magnum opus, A People's History of the United States, has sold well over 1 million copies and has continued to sell more copies each year than the year before. Maybe he is justified in his optimism. Maybe there is hope. One right-wing critic on the internet has referred to Howard Zinn as the most influential historian in America. Let us hope so. When I came up with the idea of writing a book on Zinn's life and writings, I knew I would need his cooperation. So I wrote asking him if I would have it. "Of course I'll cooperate," he wrote back promptly. "Otherwise I will appear in your book not merely as a radical, but as a surly one." Surliness has never been a prominent trait of Howard Zinn. Even people who differ with him tend to like him and respect him. Howard has devoted his career, indeed much of his life, to playing the role radicals have always played historically. They are always out there, speaking out without compromise for the causes they believe in, dragging the rest of society along, sometimes kicking and screaming. Into his 80s now, Howard continues to work for the moral values he believes in, especially peace and justice. Thus, his presence here tonight. Let us thank him for that as we welcome him to this conference. Howard.
Thank you. Thanks, Davis. Thanks. And I want to thank Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz for inviting me, and Bob Jensen also. The two of them sort of collaborated in a pincer movement which compelled me to come here. I'm especially grateful to be here and to be able to listen to Andrea Smith, because that was a revelation and an inspiration. Yeah. And, when I told my friends I was coming to Texas, well, you know what people say. There are a lot of prejudiced people on the left. That will be quoted extensively. But the truth is, when I think of Texas, I really don't think of Bush. No. In fact, when I think of any place, I don't think of Bush. You say, but no, I think of Jim Hightower. I think of, I think of Ronnie Duggar. I think of Molly Ivins. Yeah. One thing you learn as you go around the country, this whole business of red states and blue, well, Davis is an example of it. It doesn't matter. Wherever you go, there are great people. All over this country. You go to any little town, anywhere in this country, and you will find people who care about what's happening in the world. That's very encouraging. So I'm happy to be here, and I guess I'll sit down. I often find that my preliminaries take up half of my time, thanking everybody. And anyway, what should I talk about? I thought that since Haw, I never thought of it as Haw. Haw. I'm in awe of Haw. Yeah, I never thought of it Haw. But when I thought about Historians Against the War sponsoring this, well, I thought, well, okay, here's what I'll talk about. How history can be useful in understanding what's happening in Iraq and in the world. Useful not only in understanding, but more important, in acting in order to change things. Yeah, the history is useful. And you don't have to be a historian, right? And anybody can do history. I know I'll be drummed out of the American Historical Association for saying this, but it's true. Everybody can learn history, anybody can spread history, anybody can do history, and historians just do it earlier. And very often people think that the historians, what do historians do? They learn something, and then they tell other people about it. And it looks as if they knew these things from the time they were born. you see. But no, they looked it up, you know. And so you look things up, you tell them to other people, and you're a historian, you see. So, yeah, that's what I think I'll talk about. You know, sometimes I think that I will have a theme for my talk. And sometimes at the end of my talk, if people work very, very hard, they can figure out what that theme was, you see. But that's what I think. How history is useful, yeah. I came across an interesting quotation. That's another thing that historians do. They come across interesting quotations, you see, because they can't say anything interesting themselves. So they find interesting quotations. Maybe some of you have heard this. And when I heard it, I was sort of startled. It was a quote from Hermann Goering. Any of you have talked lately to Hermann Goering? But you remember Hermann Goering, right? Some of you. I never know what people know, you know, who weren't born when I was born, or lived when I was, but you know, Hermann Goering, second in command to Adolf Hitler, head of the Luftwaffe. When he was in his cell during the Nuremberg trials after World War II, when all the Nazis were, you know, rounded up in their cells, there was a psychologist who was assigned, a German-speaking psychologist, who was assigned to interview Goering. And he took notes, and he kept a diary. And he reports Goering, and they talked about all sorts of things. You know, when you're in jail, you got plenty of time to talk about lots of things. And here's what he reports Goering saying. Why, of course the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war? But after all, it's the leaders of the country who determine the policy. The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. All you have to do is tell them that they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. What struck me was any country, not just Nazism, not just in Nazi countries, but in so-called democratic countries. Works the same way. It's a little disturbing to think that there are characteristics that are common to fascist countries and so-called democratic countries, but that certainly is one characteristic that they have absolutely in common. I mean, we recognize it. It rings true to what we see around us today. But it leads you to the question of why is it? Why can people be led, as Goering says, why can people be led to go to war? And there's a kind of immediate answer that I think most of us would have. They watch television. They read the newspapers. And the newspapers and television, the media, are obsequious followers of government policy. You know, we've had so many examples of that. And I was thinking of the time that Colin Powell, remember a month before we invaded Iraq, Colin Powell went before the United Nations and he rattled off all these impressive statistics with all this evidence and pictures and graphs and so on. I love those people who get up there with pictures and graphs and so on. They're so smart and so dumb and so immoral, you see. I don't want to connect graphs with immorality, but I always do, you see. And you know, Powell, you know, gave figures on how many, you know, metric tons of chemical weapons and biological, you know, it was, you know, very impressive. The New York Times was just beside itself with praise after he, you know. We know now, of course, that this is probably, you know, the champion of speeches filled with lies. It was hard to find any speech that contained, for every cubic inch, more lies, you see. But the New York Times, wow, this was great. The Washington Post said, the editorial in the Washington Post was headed "Irrefutable," and said that after Powell's talk, it's hard to imagine how anyone could doubt that Iraq possesses weapons of mass destruction. Then the question becomes, why would people believe not just the government, but the press? And I think the answer has to do with history, or the lack of it, or the lack of historical perspective. Because if you don't have any history, if you don't know any history, it's as if you were born yesterday. And if you were born yesterday, any leader can get up there and say something, or any newspaper can tell you anything, and you have no basis for questioning it. Any leader, any person of authority can get up there and say, oh, we've got to go to war for liberty, for democracy, because we're in danger, and so on. And if you don't have any history, well, you really don't have any basis for questioning that. If you knew some history, and I'm talking now about honest history. I'm not talking about the history we get in school. I'm not talking about the history which is a history which is subservient to the presidents and the Congresses and the Supreme Courts and the establishment and recounts the things they do for us all the time. No, I'm talking about a different kind of history, an honest history. And if you know that history, even some of that history, you know how often presidents have lied to the American public. Well, you take a look at the Mexican War. You see, Polk lied to the nation about why we went to war with Mexico. It had to do with Texas, of course. So much has to do with Texas. You see, I'm going to blame Texas for everything, but no, a clash on the. There's always a precipitating event. You see, the American blood has been shed on American soil and all of that. No, it was land. But Polk lied to the nation. Just as McKinley later, at the end of the 19th century, lied to the nation about why we were going into Cuba. We're going to Cuba to liberate the Cubans from Spain, you say. Didn't say we're going into Cuba because we want to go into Cuba. Because our corporations are dying to get into Cuba, because United Fruit and the railroads and the banks want to get in. No, we're going to liberate the Cubans. And we're going to the Philippines, McKinley said, to civilize the Filipinos. We're always civilizing people, you see. And but didn't say why we really wanted the Philippines. Lies upon lies. Wilson lied to the nation, we're going to go to war, World War I, to make the world safe for democracy. The lies went on and on. Yes, even Roosevelt lied, in a certain sense by omission, by not really telling the story about America, of all the provocations that went on between the United States and Japan before Pearl Harbor. Harry Truman lied when he told the nation that the atomic bomb was dropped. Listen to this. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima was dropped on a military target. Those were his words, on a military target. And of course, everybody lied about Vietnam. John F. Kennedy lied about the extent of our involvement in Vietnam, and didn't tell about the secret bombing missions that American flyers were there when they was just supposed to be advisors. And LBJ lied about the Gulf of Tonkin, and Nixon lied about the secret bombing of Cambodia, and so on. The lies went on and on. Reagan lied about after the Vietnam War, about why we went into Grenada. And the Bush Sr. lied about why we went into Panama and destroyed whole neighborhoods and killed several thousand people in Panama. And then, of course, more recently, we've had, again, lies lies about Iraq, but the first war, we're going in because they took Kuwait. And of course, they did take Kuwait. They did commit an act of aggression, Iraq, Kuwait. But can anyone believe that the senior Bush was just heartbroken over what happened to Kuwait? You know, that he couldn't fathom why one nation would invade another. You know. Anyway, there's oh, by the way, about the Philippines, talking about historical amnesia, and I don't know if you saw this, but 4 or 5 years ago, Bush addressed the National Assembly in the Philippines, and he said to them, "America is proud of its part in the great story of the Filipino people. Together, our soldiers liberated the Philippines from colonial rule." Well, if you didn't know any history, you would believe him. If you knew some history, you would know that the United States fought a bloody war against the Filipinos in which more than 500,000 Filipinos were killed, in which atrocities took place against the Filipinos, and then we occupied the Philippines for another 50 years, keeping in power dictatorship after dictatorship in the Philippines. And you'd have to know some history to know what a lie that was. Colin Powell at one point talked about historical amnesia. Colin Powell was annoyed at one point because the Mexican ambassador to the United States said that the United States was treating Mexico as its backyard. And Colin Powell said something like, "That's not nice. We have too much of a history that we have gone through together." Well, yeah, that's true. But he didn't say what that history was. He didn't say we invaded Mexico and took 45% of its territory. That was our history, you see. But it's important, you know, I think, to look at the record and to know the history of lies, so that the next time anybody gets up before the microphone who represents authority and says we have to go to war, well, you will be very, very skeptical. Rudyard Kipling, I like to quote Rudyard Kipling because he was a great imperialist. But Rudyard Kipling, although he was a great imperialist, had another side to him, and that he had twinges of pain thinking of what imperialism did. And at one point he said, if any should, and speaking in one of his poems as a soldier, he said, if any should ask why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. Anyway. There's another reason, I think, for sort of easy acceptance of what the government tells us and what the press tells us. And this reason is very deeply ingrained in American culture. And it's the idea that we, the people, and the government have a common interest. This is the biggest lie. No, really. But it goes way back. It starts way back with the Constitution and the Founding Fathers, and you know, the Constitution starts, we the people, as if we the people have put together the Constitution instead of 55 rich white men put together the Constitution, you know, and as if black people and Indians and women and working people had something to do. But the myth was, and perpetuated all these years and all these generations, you know, that, yeah, it's our government, it's we the people, it's our Constitution, it's our, and so on. And it takes a little history to understand the falsity of that statement, even though the culture goes to great lengths to make us think our interests are the same. You know, the culture has a language that tries to bind us all together. It uses the words national interest, national security, national defense, as if they applied equally to everybody, as if, you know, their security is our security, their defense is our defense, you know, as if, you know, Exxon and I have the same interests, you see, or as if Bush and the guy he sends to Vietnam have the same interests. No, in the history of this country has been a history of clashing interests from the very beginning, of slave owner versus slave, and landlord versus tenant, and the rich against the poor, and we have. You're not supposed to talk about class in this country. You're not supposed to suggest that there are classes in this country. It's sort of Marxist. Marx talked about classes. So I suppose James Madison was a Marxist, because James Madison said before Marx was born, well, otherwise he might have been called a Marxist, you see. But Madison said, you know, society is divided into groups depending on whether you have property or you don't have property, and there will be an inevitable clash between these groups. Now they were more candid in those days than our leaders are today. I mean, not only that they were more eloquent, or they could talk, they could write, you know. I've got to hand it to them. Even though they were slave owners and merchants and bondholders, and they fashioned a government that would serve their interests, they were articulate, without monitors. Yeah. And but clashes, class conflict all through American history. You know, in the colonial period, before the Revolution, during the Revolution, with the mutinies of privates in Washington's army against the officers in the army. After the Revolution, with the rebellions of farmers in Western Massachusetts and New Jersey and South Carolina and Maryland, rebellions of farmers after the Revolution, veterans who had been in the war and now didn't like the lives that they were leading and felt oppressed by the rich. And I mean, all through American history, we've had these clashes of those who had and those who did not. And so it's very important to know that, because if you think that the people up there who get up there before the microphone and tell you you're going to war have your interests at heart, you are making a terrible mistake. You are making a mistake of life and death, a dangerous thing to do. Let me I'm just, you know, this is going against, when you talk this way, I suddenly find myself talking this way. And if you talk this way, you feel, well, you're doing something wrong. Because that idea of we're all together, so deeply ingrained, and you learn when you go to school, that they're the three branches of government, and they represent us. And if one doesn't represent us, the others will, because we have checks and balances. That is the biggest lie has ever been told in any government or civics class, that we have checks and balances. You see, the only checks and balance we have ever had was when the people checked and balanced what the government did by their social movements. Another reason why people are led to believe authority from the start is the notion, again, ingrained from early on, that we are a special country, a special nation. We are the best. We are the greatest. We are number one. And it's not just that we're number one in this or that. We're number one in virtue. We are the most moral and virtuous. We are the Boy Scouts of the world. We will help countries across the street, you see. That's what we do, you see. And that's what we stand for. It starts very early. It starts with the Pledge of Allegiance, you know, liberty and justice. I mean, you're a kid in first grade. You don't even know what they're talking about. You don't know what you're saying. You're saying liberty and justice for all. And then they force you to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, you know, and the land of the free and the home of the brave. You imagine little black kids in the South singing, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Maybe those little black kids know better, but the little white kids may not. But that's, you know, and then, of course, we were all brought up on God Bless America, our second national anthem, you know. And I haven't heard anybody publicly ask, why would God care about this 5% of the world's population, and he is choosing to bless us? You know, why do we deserve it any more than anybody else? When you grow up on this diet of self-congratulation, well, then means that, well, the president says, yes, we're going to help other people, and we're going to spread democracy, we're going to spread liberty. If you don't know the history of what we have done to spread liberty in the world, you know, then you might believe it. But if you know some of that history, you will know that just 6 years after John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, the first governor of Massachusetts, 6 years after John Winthrop proclaims Massachusetts Bay as the city on the hill. So this is the beginning of that idea. Years later, Ronald Reagan embroidered on it, the golden city on the hill. You see, we're going to be the cynosure of the world. Everybody would look to us, you see, and that's what Winthrop was talking about, the city on the hill. And 6 years after that, the city on the hill massacred 600 Pequot Indians, men, women, and children. That was a sign of what was to come. And this especially virtuous nation then marauded across the country and committed one of the great acts of ethnic cleansing in history by annihilating Indian tribes and massacring them and driving them out of their lands. And that was just the beginning of a history which is hardly virtuous. But then, you know, going into Mexico and sending our troops into Central America and sending the Marines into the Caribbean again and again and again, and taking Cuba and taking the Philippines and taking Hawaii, and then the wars go on, and the aggression goes on, and the aggression becomes particularly blatant after World War II, when we are now one of the great superpowers, one of the two great superpowers of the world. It's very interesting that exactly at that moment, that is at the end of World War II, when the United States is going to move from its rather limited imperial activities, mostly in the Western Hemisphere and out in the Philippines, it's going to move from that into all the other areas of the world and really become the #1 war-making power of the world. Exactly at that point, the Department of War changes its name to Department of Defense. A friend of mine, a novelist and a wonderful writer named James Carroll, has just written a book which will be out soon, which you should look for. It's a history of the Pentagon, and the title of the book is House of War. You know, thinking of our reputation as an especially virtuous nation, not like the others, say. I wanted to read to you a little of Langston Hughes. That's, if you don't know Langston Hughes poetry, you should, but a black poet of the Harlem Renaissance of the 20s and 30s, called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is one of the best things you can say about anybody. He wrote this poem called Columbia representing the United States. Columbia, my dear girl, you really haven't been a virgin so long. It's ludicrous to keep up the pretext. You're terribly involved in world assignations, and everybody knows it. You've slept with all the big powers in military uniforms, and you've taken the sweet life of all the little brown fellows in loincloths and cotton trousers. When they've resisted, you've yelled rape, being one of the world's big vampires. Why don't you come out and say so, like Japan and England and France and all the other nymphomaniacs of power? A little harsh. But black people have generally been more reluctant to go along with the glory of American empire than other people. I can't imagine why, you see, but they have. I'm thinking of Zora Neale Hurston, that great, wonderful, unusual writer who would take no crap from anybody. From white people, from black people, from anybody. She was just her own person. And she was just said what she felt. And in the midst of World War II, the great war against fascism, everybody is for it. And so on. And she is saying, I can't get excited when I see, that, oh, yes, Hitler is overrunning Europe. And it's true. But what about England overrunning Asia? And what about Holland overrunning Africa? And Belgium running over Central Africa? And what about all these Western powers overrunning the darker peoples of the world? When Truman dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, she called him, what did she call him? The butcher of Asia. She wrote some of this in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on the Road, and the publisher cut out the parts that were critical of the United States during World War II. They were only restored years later, after the war was over. And, well, just an example of the notion that we are different. And in 1899, which was just about at the beginning of our bloody war in the Philippines, the Secretary of War, Elia Root, said, "The American soldier is different from all other soldiers of all other countries since the world began. He is the advance guard of liberty and justice, of law and order, and of peace and happiness." You read those words. Oh, time.
No.
Oh, I got scared. No. So I'm easily intimidated by people who are in charge of meetings. Yeah.
Should you talk into the microphone?
Talk into the microphone. Yeah. Oh, nobody has heard anything that I've said. Okay. I'm going to start all over. No, really, it's okay. I won't move. Anyway, reading Elia Root about the American soldiers different, and then reading about what our soldiers have done in, well, not just Abu Ghraib, and not just in Guantanamo, But, in Afghanistan, and, and you have to read the papers carefully, and you see it's these are not isolated instances. And here our soldiers are different, and they're torture and torture and torture, and holding people and sending people to other countries so that they can torture them. And I was thinking when there was all this fuss in the newspapers and television, I guess there still is, about the accidental shooting. Maybe you know what I'm talking about, you see. But an enormous amount of attention paid to the fact that Cheney accidentally shot his hunting companion. So this guy was wounded, not good. But what about all those people who have died as a result of Cheney's policies? What about those people, this man has buckshot in him, true, but there are men and women who've come back without legs and arms and blinded because of the policies of Cheney and Bush and the others, and this absolutely cowardly media will not deal with that issue. I mean, are soldiers different? I mean, I'm just reading an account of just one of so many accounts of what our occupation in Iraq is doing. And you hear people saying, well, we can't leave Iraq. Things will be bad if we leave Iraq. Yes. And this is an American officer talking to a reporter and telling him what he did. He said, well, one of his men was killed. And so he ordered his men to wrap the village where this man was killed, wrap the village in barbed wire, and issue ID cards to all the men in the village between 17 and 65, put up checkpoints, and the ID cards were, by the way, were in English only. And if you have one of these cards, you can come and go. And this old man in the village says, it's like a prison now. The Americans do night raids, come into our houses when the women are sleeping. We can't fight them. We don't have any weapons. No, the United States, I'm not trying to paint the United States as, well, yes, I am. Yeah, I guess what I mean to say, the United States is behaving like all imperial powers have behaved, except that we have the capacity to do more of it. We have taken over. We're doing it better. We have more weapons. We have more capacity. And so, I mean, this is what imperial powers do, and that's what we are doing. It's important when you present people that you know with history. And to make it clear to them that, no, the history of the United States does not show us as having a special claim to moral superiority, does not show us as the kind of country that can be trusted to bring democracy and liberty to other countries, doesn't show us as a country where the expenditure of human life is justified because we are going to bring liberty and democracy. When you talk about this, of course there will be people who will sort of bridle at this, you're anti-American. No. How many times I've had this said to me? And one of the reviews of my book, Davis, you may remember this, because Davis remembers all of the reviews of my book. The headline in this sort of right-wing newspaper said, Zinn's Hate America History. Hate America. And anybody who looks upon criticism of American policy, of governmental policy, as hating America, has a very distorted notion of what America is. America is not George Bush. It's very important to make that clear. America is not the three branches of government. It's not the people up there in power. America is the people of this country, the black, white, men, women, struggling, working people. That's America. Those people, you see, those people. No. They are those people in Washington, those people who have the power. They are aliens. They have come from somewhere and taken over this country. It's a beautiful country, and they have taken it over. Men with no concern for human life and no concern for human liberty have taken over this country. And our job is to take it back. You see, that's our job. And I must say this also. I must say everything that I'm saying, I must say. You see, I wouldn't say things to you that I don't have to say. You see. But it's not just the war in Iraq, and it's not just Bush. It's not just the Republican Party, it's Clinton. If you go back and look at Clinton's record in foreign policy, and you look at Clinton's words, when Clinton used the words weapons of mass destruction as an excuse to bomb Iraq, if you look at Clinton's words, and the same as Bush's words, we're going to spread liberty around the world. No, it's not just Bush, it's not just the Republican Party, it's those people who have been running the country. And it's not just this war, it's not just the Iraq war, because at some point the United States is going to have to get out of Iraq. Whether it likes it or not, it's going to have to get out of Iraq. It's going to have to get out of Iraq because, the numbers of people in this country opposed to the war have been growing and growing and growing and will grow more. And the number of GIs who are coming back from Iraq and speaking out against the war is going to grow and grow. And the number of people like Cindy Sheehan, the mothers and fathers who have lost somebody in the war, they're going to be more and more of them. And the point is going to be reached where they simply won't be able to carry it on anymore. But it's not just Iraq, it's war itself. War itself. And I say this as a person who was in a war. I say this not to give me any special credentials over, let's say, those people in power who never were in the war and who evaded the war. If they evaded the war because they were against the war, I would applaud them. But if they were for the war and they evaded the war, that's cowardly, you see. And I was in the good war. You know what the good war is. World War II is the good war, the best of wars. I volunteered. I was an enthusiastic Air Force bombardier. And so I bombed cities in Germany and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and even the Atlantic coast of France. And at the end of it, only at the end of it, only after it was over, did I begin to think about what I had done. Only when I read Hiroshima by John Hersey, and when I read his accounts of his talking to survivors in Hiroshima shortly after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And you can imagine what those survivors looked like. People without arms and legs, people blinded, people whose skin you could not bear to look at. And I read his accounts. I read the words of those people, and I read his descriptions of those people, and I thought, wow, this is what bombing does. I had been dropping bombs, and I had no idea what bombing did. I never saw people. I never saw human beings. We flied from 30,000 feet up. Never saw anybody. Didn't hear anybody screaming. Didn't see kids with their limbs torn off. Didn't see any blood. Just I realized then what modern war is like and how much of it is no human beings are on the other end. Whether you can see them or not, they're really not really human beings. You see, they're the enemy. I came to the conclusion that war poisons the soul of everybody who engages in it. And the so-called good, there's no such thing as a good war. No such thing. The war is, an abomination. War corrupts everybody who is involved in it. And it's, and what you do in war, when you bomb another country, because the other country is run by a tyrant, whether it's Hitler or Saddam Hussein or the Japanese imperial class, what you do when you bomb that country, you are killing the victims of the tyrant of that country. War cannot be accepted. This is the conclusion, I came to. And also war, even when it seems to accomplish something, we got rid of Hitler, we got rid of Mussolini, et cetera, when it seems to accomplish something, it doesn't last. It's like, I think June Jordan, the black poet on the West Coast, said about the Iraq War, it's like crack. Give you a high, wow, we won. And then you look around afterward, and you see what the world is like. And then you come down from where you were. So I think our job is not just, we need to stop this war, of course, but we need, I think, also to make up our minds that we are going to carry on a campaign against war, against militarism, against the stealing of our wealth in order to feed the military-industrial complex, in order to feed the egos of our leaders and the profits of the corporations. We need to do that. And not only that, and it's not, and now I was listening, to Andrea, and listen to her words that it's possible. It's possible to defeat great power. Those of us who have been in movements, those who are in the South in the civil rights movement or in the anti-war movement or in the women's movement have seen that without the benefit of power in Washington, against great odds, and very often when it seemed hopeless, things were accomplished. Legal segregation in the South was done away with because black people understood that they had to do it themselves. And the anti-war movement, which started very small, tiny, seemed impossible to do anything to get this government to stop the war. The movement grew and grew and grew. And now we have seen all over the world where movements, relatively nonviolent movements, just because the more people you have on your side, the less you are inclined to use violence. You have enough people on your side, you don't need violence. You have enough, if you have a million people gathering in the capital of a country, the dictator will flee without a shot being fired. We've seen that happen. And we have people all over this country who already are speaking up and protesting, and we have somebody just handed me something about here in Austin. There's a campaign on to stop military recruiting in the high schools. This is very important, I could tell you about a lot of other good things that are going on. I keep a file of good things. But it's a big file. Too much to tell you about now, but there are a lot of good things going on that people are doing, which are very heartening. But instead of doing that, I will just read, I'll just end by reading a poem, because the poets know best. The poets say things that the rest of us very often can't quite say. This is a poem by Marge Piercy, and it's from a volume of poetry called The Moon is Always Female. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone, you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they roll over you. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall. 1,000 have solidarity and your own newsletter. 10,000 power in your own paper, 100,000 your own media, 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. Thank you.